Imagine waking up tomorrow to find out that a massive Fortune 500 corporation just lost its CEO.
Right.
And I mean, not just the CEO, but its entire board of directors.
Gone.
Gone. Its top regional managers, all of his lead engineers, and this all happens in a single week.
That's a total wipeout.
Exactly. Now, imagine that corporation isn't, selling software or building cars. Imagine they are trying to coordinate a multi-front geopolitical war.
Yeah, the stakes are just slightly higher than a bad quarterly earnings report.
Right. Can they keep the lights on the next day? I mean, maybe. But their 10-year roadmap, their institutional memory, the very foundation of how they operate, that is completely incinerated.
It is a catastrophic level of organizational shock. There's really no other way to put it.
Yeah.
And yet, if you look at how this specific conflict, the ongoing war involving Iran, if you look at how it's being presented to the public, you rarely hear about that underlying structural collapse.
You really don't.
You see the immediate visible actions, right. But the invisible degradation of power is often, well, completely ignored.
Which is exactly why we are doing this today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are looking at this conflict, but we are deliberately stepping away from the daily chaotic headlines to look at the actual measurable foundation of the war.
Because that's where the real story is.
Exactly. And to do this, we're unpacking a really fascinating combination of sources today. We have a highly passionate blog post written by Paramendra Kumar Bhagat.
And he actually notes in the piece that he was Barack Obama's first full-time volunteer in New York City.
Yeah, that's a really interesting detail he includes. So his post is titled Barack Face, John Spencer on the War So Far. And Bhagat uses his platform to highlight, quote, and heavily analyze a very dense military assessment written by John Spencer.
Right, titled, Who Has the Upper Hand in Iran?
That's the one.
It creates a really interesting dynamic for us to explore today, I think.
Yeah.
You have the cold calculating metrics of a military assessment, right? But it's nested entirely inside the fiery, politically charged commentary of a blogger who is demanding immediate geopolitical change.
It's quite a mix. And because of that dynamic, just a quick heads up to you listening before we really get into the weeds here.
Yeah, this is important.
The blogs and military assessments we are looking at today are incredibly passionate. They lean hard into their specific political viewpoints.
Very.
So we need to be crystal clear. We're not taking sides here, nor are we endorsing any of the viewpoints, left-wing, right-wing, whatever, presented in these sources.
Not our job.
Not our job at all. Our sole job today is to impartially report on the content provided, act as your tour guides, and help you understand the arguments and the strategic math these authors are doing.
That neutrality is vital, honestly, because the core argument we are dissecting today challenges a lot of preconceived notions. The central tension here is the profound difference between a nation that is merely surviving a conflict and a nation that possesses the strategic leverage to actually win.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because Bhagat starts his piece by taking an absolute sledgehammer to the modern media landscape.
He really goes after them.
He explicitly calls the coverage of this war a circus. And he points his finger directly at the media in the United States and India.
Which he notes are the two largest democracies on Earth.
Right. And he argues that their fundamental business model relies on framing this conflict as a neck-and-neck nail-biter to keep viewers engaged.
And, I mean, he is tapping into a very real phenomenon regarding how democratic societies consume information about global conflicts.
How so?
Well, there is a deep, almost psychological demand for narrative suspense. Think about it. If a news network comes on and says, the structural capabilities of one side have been systematically degraded over a 6-month period, and the long-term outcome is mathematically highly probable.
You just change the channel.
Instantly. That is boring. But if you treat a war like a primetime sports match, where every missile launch is a point on the board and every day is a new quarter, you keep the audience hooked.
But I want to push back on Bhagat's premise here for a second, because I can hear someone listening to this and thinking, wait a minute, if my news feed is full of videos of Iranian missiles flying through the night sky, isn't that actual proof of parity? It isn't just a media circus if things are actually exploding, right?
I get that reaction, but that is the exact illusion that Spencer's analysis tries to dismantle.
Yeah.
He points out a very dangerous habit in modern analysis, which is confusing survival with victory.
Okay, explain that.
Or confusing the capacity for action with strategic viability. Just because a military apparatus can execute an order like launching a salvo of missiles does not mean it is operating from a position of strength.
Right.
Spencer argues the regime is flooding the zone with these visible strikes because it masks the severe internal degradation of their actual capabilities.
You know, it reminds me of a boxer who has made it to the 12th round, but he is completely devastated.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Like, he's heavily concussed, his ribs are cracked, his corner is in absolute panic.
Yeah.
But he is still standing in the middle of the ring, throwing these massive, wild, looping punches.
Hoping for a knockout.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you just watch a 5-second video clip of that wild punch on social media, it looks terrifying. It looks like a competitive fight.
Right. Out of context.
But if you look at the physical reality of the fighter, he has no endurance, no defense, and no real path to winning. He is just relying on muscle memory and reflex.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. Those wild punches are the missile strikes we see on television. They generate the clicks, they fulfill the media's need for a neck-and-neck narrative, but they obscure the reality that the fighter is fundamentally broken.
Right.
Spencer argues that if you look past the clickbait, the foundations of Iranian power, the institutions that actually sustain long-term influence, have been systematically dismantled.
So let's look at those foundations. Let's look at the actual structural damage here.
Yeah.
Because the first thing Spencer details is the decapitation of the military's leadership. And the sheer scale of the personnel losses he lists is just hard to fathom. We are talking about the elimination of senior IRGC commanders, missile force leaders, top intelligence officials, nuclear scientists, operational planners, and the supreme leader himself.
To understand the gravity of this, we really need to clarify what the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC, actually is. Because it is not just a standard military branch like an army or a navy.
What is it then?
It is a parallel structure. It's part military, part intelligence agency, part corporate conglomerate, and part ideological enforcer. Their leaders aren't just generals, they are the political and economic power brokers of the state.
Wow. Okay, so the assessment specifically names Mohammad Bagheri and Hossein Salami, referring to them as the institutional backbone of this network.
Yes.
But here is where I get stuck, and maybe you can clarify this. Militaries have chains of command. They have succession plans. If a general goes down, the colonel steps up. Going back to our Fortune 500 analogy, if the CEO leaves, the COO takes over. So why is the loss of these specific individuals considered such a catastrophic, unrecoverable blow?
It comes down to the nature of the system. Because in a highly centralized authoritarian system, power is not institutional. It is deeply personal.
Okay, so it's not just a title on an org chart.
Exactly. It is based on trust, paranoia, and decades of relationship building. You don't just hand a manual to the next guy in line. Bagheri and Salami spent decades building this regional network of proxies and intelligence assets.
Right.
They knew where the money was hidden, they knew which foreign intermediaries could be trusted, and they held the ideological loyalty of the various factions together. When you shatter that command relationship in the opening phases of a war, you don't just lose a commander, you lose the network.
So the people who take their place are basically flying blind.
Completely. The survivors are forced to maintain continuity, make split-second strategic decisions, and manage a sprawling regional conflict, all while under constant targeted bombardment.
That's a nightmare scenario for any organization.
You cannot replace 30 years of operational intuition and back-channel relationships with a newly promoted officer overnight. The organizational shock is profound.
Okay, so the architects of the strategy are gone. But what about the ultimate tool they were trying to build?
Right. The nuclear program.
The prize that this entire strategy was designed to protect. Spencer describes a level of physical destruction here that completely rewrites the reality on the ground.
The assessment is incredibly blunt about this. The physical ecosystem that supported Iran's nuclear ambitions, so we're talking enrichment sites, subterranean complexes, centrifuge manufacturing facilities, and specialized research centers.
The whole apparatus.
Yes, all of it is now, in Spencer's words, buried under rubble.
Yeah.
Decades of financial investment and scientific effort have been physically erased.
But let me play devil's advocate again, because even Bagat, in his blog post, is demanding that the regime hand over their enriched uranium.
Right, he's very focused on that.
That implies there is still a massive looming threat. And you hear people say all the time, well, you can't bomb knowledge. They still have the scientists. They still have the blueprints. They can just build it back.
You hear that a lot.
Why is Spencer so dismissive of the idea that they could just restart this program in a few months?
Because it fundamentally misunderstands what it takes to enrich uranium to weapons-grade levels. People imagine a group of smart scientists in a lab with some test tubes and a blueprint.
Right, like a movie montage.
Exactly. But industrial-scale enrichment is an extraordinarily fragile, highly complex manufacturing ecosystem.
Break that ecosystem down for us. What does it actually look like mechanically?
So to spin centrifuges at the supersonic speeds required to separate uranium isotopes, you need rotors made from highly specialized carbon fiber or specific miraging steel alloys. And those materials require extreme precision machine tooling. The machines that make the parts have to be perfectly calibrated in climate-controlled, vibration-proof environments. If the rotor is off by a fraction of a millimeter, the centrifuge literally tears itself apart.
Oh, wow. So it's like a hyper-advanced assembly line where every single piece is a potential point of failure.
Yes. And it relies on a global clandestine supply chain to acquire the specific vacuum pumps, the frequency converters, and the specialized materials.
Which are heavily sanctioned, I assume.
Highly sanctioned.
Right.
So when those manufacturing facilities are turned to rubble, you haven't just delayed the scientists, you have broken the physical capacity to create the machines that do the work.
That makes perfect sense. It's like saying that because I have a master's degree in mechanical engineering and a set of blueprints, I can build a Ferrari in my driveway next week. I mean, I can't. Because the blueprint is useless. If someone blew up the billion-dollar factory, the robotic assembly arms, the master mechanics, and the supply chain that delivers the specialized parts, the raw knowledge just doesn't equal industrial capacity.
That is a perfect analogy. And this brings us to a crucial strategic term that Spencer uses in his text, the fait accompli.
A done deal.
Exactly. The entirety of Iran's strategy over the last 20 years was to build this nuclear capability, wrap it in layers of underground bunkers, surround it with a ring of heavily armed proxies, and present it to the world as a fait accompli.
Like, we have it, don't even try to take it.
Yes. They wanted the West to look at this fortified shield and conclude that the political and military cost of trying to stop the nuclear program was simply too high.
They were betting that the world would just accept a nuclear Iran rather than risk the absolute nightmare of trying to dismantle that shield.
Precisely. But this conflict proved that the shield was an illusion. The underground facilities were penetrable. The proxy deterrent was insufficient. The fait accompli failed spectacularly. And here's the kicker. Even though the facilities are destroyed, the strategic damage to Iran's diplomatic standing is permanent.
How so? I mean, if the facilities are gone, doesn't that relieve the diplomatic pressure? The threat is neutralized, right?
No, because it validates every fear the non-proliferation community has held for decades. Iran always claimed its program was for peaceful civilian energy purposes.
Right, they always maintain that.
But by pushing the enrichment level so high and building such massive, fortified, clandestine structures, they showed their hand. The mask has completely slipped.
Oh, I see.
Any future negotiations, whether about handing over the remaining uranium as Bagat demands or lifting sanctions, will happen in an environment of absolute zero trust. They proved they were building toward a weapon.
Okay, so the nuclear shield is gone, the leadership is gone. But what about their conventional deterrent? Because going back to our boxer analogy, those missiles we keep seeing on our news feeds, those are the wild punches keeping the media circus alive.
This is where we have to understand the difference between expending a stockpile and sustaining industrial production.
Yeah.
Before this conflict escalated, analysts estimated that Iran could manufacture roughly 100 ballistic missiles a month.
A month.
Yes, that industrial output was the backbone of their conventional military power.
100 ballistic missiles a month is an incredible manufacturing feat. But what is the status of that production line now?
According to the assessment, it has effectively collapsed. The machine tooling centers, the solid fuel mixing facilities, the final assembly plants, and the storage depots have all been systematically targeted.
And again, this comes back to the specialized manufacturing you mentioned with the centrifuges, right? You don't just mix solid rocket fuel in a bathtub.
Exactly. Solid fuel motors require massive, highly specialized planetary mixers. If you destroy the building housing those mixers, you can't just buy a new one on the open market. They are heavily sanctioned, highly monitored pieces of equipment. Spencer makes a very sharp observation here. He writes, "A state can expend missiles quickly in war. Rebuilding the industrial base that creates them is a much slower process."
And it isn't just their land-based missiles that suffered. The assessment dives deep into what happened to their maritime capabilities, and this leads to what might be the most fascinating strategic miscalculation of the entire conflict.
You're referring to their strategy around the Strait of Hormuz?
Yes, because for years, Iran invested heavily in what is known as asymmetric maritime warfare. Can you define what that actually looks like in practice?
Sure. Traditional naval warfare is about large destroyers and aircraft carriers matching up against each other. Asymmetric maritime warfare is about using cheaper, unconventional tactics to overwhelm a superior force.
Right, swarming tactics.
Exactly. For Iran, this meant investing in hundreds of heavily armed fast-attack speedboats, sea mines, coastal anti-ship missile batteries, and submarine midgets.
And the entire purpose of this asymmetric fleet was to threaten the Strait of Hormuz, which is one of the most critical maritime choke points in the world. I mean, a massive percentage of the world's oil flows through that narrow strip of water.
It's vital.
The source actually quotes Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who called Iran's ability to close the strait an economic nuclear weapon.
The theory in Tehran was simple. If the United States or its allies push us too hard or threaten our survival, we will swarm the strait, sink commercial tankers, drop sea mines, and effectively detonate the global economy.
Right.
They believed the fear of $200 a barrel oil would force the West to back down.
And I want to connect this directly to you, the listener, for a second, because this isn't just abstract geopolitics. If Iran successfully closes the Strait of Hormuz, the price of crude oil skyrockets globally within hours.
Almost instantly.
That means within days, the price of gas at your local station could double. The cost of shipping groceries to your local supermarket spikes. That was the leverage Iran thought they had over the daily lives of people halfway across the world.
But the assessment points out that this strategy massively historically backfired. By constantly brandishing this economic nuclear weapon and threatening the prosperity of everyone around them, Iran didn't secure leverage.
What did they do?
They just convinced the entire region that they were an intolerable threat to global stability.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. The text notes that regional governments like the United Arab Emirates began openly aligning with Israel. These are wealthy Gulf states whose entire economic future depends on the safe export of energy.
Right.
When Iran proved that the transit routes were fundamentally unreliable, what did those Gulf states do?
They engineered their way around the problem. Wealthy nations despise economic uncertainty, so instead of bowing to Tehran's threats, these states accelerated massive infrastructure projects.
Like what?
They built new pipelines across the Arabian Peninsula to bypass the strait entirely. They expanded port infrastructure on the Red Sea and the Gulf of Oman.
It is an incredible irony. By trying to hold the global economy hostage, Iran essentially expedited its own isolation. The global economy simply built a bypass road.
Yes. As Spencer summarizes it, threatening commerce is not the same thing as commanding the sea. They completely lost control of the maritime domain.
And while losing the sea is devastating to their leverage, losing the sky is what triggers the collapse of their domestic economy.
Absolutely.
We have to look at what the assessment says about the degradation of Iran's integrated air defense system.
Let's break that down. When we say an integrated air defense system, or IADs, we aren't just talking about a guy with a shoulder-fired missile.
No, an IADs is a highly complex, layered network. It involves long-range, early warning radars that detect incoming threats hundreds of miles away.
Right.
Those radars feed data to command and control centers, which then assign targets to various SAM batteries, surface-to-air missile launchers. It is designed to create an impenetrable dome of overlapping coverage over critical infrastructure.
But Spencer notes that this system was methodically dismantled. Radars were blinded, command nodes were destroyed, and the SAM batteries were eliminated.
Just systematically taken apart.
Yes. And this resulted in what military analysts call uncontested airspace, allowing Israeli and American aircraft to operate repeatedly over Iranian territory.
And Spencer delivers a line here that I think is the most important sentence in his entire analysis.
That's it.
He writes, "Once a country loses the ability to contest its own airspace, every other vulnerability becomes magnified."
It's so true, because if your enemy can fly over your sovereign territory with impunity, the concept of a safe area ceases to exist.
Right.
Your leadership cannot hide in a bunker because bunker-busting munitions can be dropped precisely on the roof. Your factories cannot produce weapons because the moment a truck leaves the loading dock, it is destroyed. Your military cannot maneuver because any large-scale movement is instantly detected and struck from above.
The physical vulnerability is absolute. And that absolute physical vulnerability creates absolute economic panic. The text references data from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the FDD estimating economic losses from this conflict running well into the hundreds of billions of dollars.
Hundreds of billions.
And it isn't just the cost of replacing bombed buildings.
No, the direct physical damage is just the tip of the iceberg. The real destruction is in the compounding economic mechanics.
Walk us through that. What does that compounding failure look like?
Let's look at capital flight, for example. When the airspace is open to enemy bombers and the major industrial centers are at risk, domestic and foreign investors panic. Anyone with wealth in the country desperately tries to move their assets out.
But how do they do that in a sanctioned economy? They can't just wire money to a Swiss bank.
Right, they can't. So they convert their local currency, the real, into foreign currencies like US dollars or euros on the black market at exorbitant rates. Or they buy gold. Or they smuggle assets out through informal networks.
Okay, so everyone is dumping the local currency.
Exactly. This massive sell-off of the local currency causes its value to absolutely plummet. And when the currency collapses, the cost of importing basic goods like food, medicine, industrial parts skyrockets. That is hyperinflation.
So the supply chains fracture, production grinds to a halt because factories can't afford raw materials, and the average citizen suddenly can't afford groceries.
Yes.
It is a cascading domino effect. You can't just flip a switch and fix a fractured national economy. Even if a peace treaty was signed tomorrow, it would take years.
Years, if not decades. And when an economy is in a death spiral of that magnitude, the political strain on the regime becomes impossible to conceal.
Which is dangerous for them.
Very. Authoritarian governments rely on projecting an image of absolute unity, competence, and control. But the assessment notes that Iranian leaders are increasingly contradicting each other in public over how to respond, whether to negotiate, and how to manage the crisis.
That public fracturing is incredibly telling.
Okay.
And you can see how deeply terrified the regime is of their own population because they resort to heavy, prolonged internet blackouts.
Right.
Spencer makes a brilliant observation about this. He says, governments confident in their domestic stability rarely isolate their own citizens from the outside world.
It is a profound tell. The regime isn't shutting down the internet just to hide their military movements from foreign intelligence.
They're shutting it down because they are terrified of their own people.
Exactly. They are terrified of them communicating, organizing, and realizing the full extent of the state's weakness. The internet blackout is a symptom of a collapsing domestic front.
Which brings us to the final pillar of their strategy.
The proxies.
Right. Their leadership is shattered. The nuclear program is rubble, the missile factories are dark, the sea is lost, the sky is open, and the economy is imploding. So what happens to their external strategy? What happens to the famous Ring of Fire, the massive proxy network they spent decades building across the Middle East?
For a very long time, this proxy network was viewed as Iran's masterpiece of asymmetric warfare.
It was incredibly effective.
The concept was brilliant in its simplicity. Fund, arm, and train proxy militias in surrounding countries to fight your enemies, ensuring that the actual devastating consequences of war happen far away from your own borders.
It offered Tehran incredible strategic depth at a very low direct cost.
Right. But the assessment lays out how this hub-and-spoke model has essentially broken down under simultaneous multi-front pressure.
Let's really dig into these proxy fronts, because treating them as a monolith misses the nuances of the collapse. Let's start with Hamas.
The transformation of Hamas over the course of this conflict is stark. Prior to October 7th, they were a heavily armed, deeply entrenched military organization functioning almost as a state within a state.
Right.
But the resulting war has systematically dismantled their upper echelons of leadership, their vast subterranean tunnel networks, and their localized weapons production.
The text refers to them now as a battered and isolated insurgent remnant.
Yeah.
I mean, they can still conduct guerrilla attacks, but their utility to Iran as a major regional instrument of power projection is largely gone.
Correct, but the much more significant blow to Iran's regional architecture involves Hezbollah.
Oh, yes.
The text refers to Hezbollah as Iran's crown jewel of deterrence. They were the most heavily armed non-state actor in the world, positioned right on Israel's northern border.
And Hezbollah has suffered unprecedented losses. Senior leadership eliminated, communication networks compromised, massive weapons caches destroyed.
Huge losses.
But the text highlights a broader geopolitical earthquake that changes the reality for Hezbollah, fundamentally. And that is the fall of the Assad regime in Syria.
We cannot overstate the historical and logistical importance of this event.
Walk us through it. Why is Syria so important?
To understand why Assad's fall is so devastating to Hezbollah and Iran, you have to look at a map. How does Iran get a massive, heavy ballistic missile from a factory in Tehran to a launch pad in southern Lebanon?
I mean, they can't just fly it there on a commercial plane.
Exactly. They relied on a physical land bridge. Weapons, money, and fighters moved from Iran through the porous borders of Iraq into Syria. The Assad regime allowed Syria to be used as a massive logistical corridor and staging ground.
So it was just a highway for weapons.
Convoys of trucks moved across the Syrian desert, facilitated by corrupt officials and allied militias, crossing the border into Lebanon to resupply Hezbollah.
So when the Assad regime collapses, that entire highway is essentially permanently severed.
Yes. The new realities in Syria, combined with relentless aerial interdiction campaigns, mean that Hezbollah is suddenly cut off from its primary source of resupply.
Wow.
They are fighting a high-intensity war of attrition, but the tap from Tehran has been turned off. The perception of Hezbollah as an untouchable, inexhaustible proxy army has been fundamentally shattered.
And it's not just Hamas and Hezbollah. The Houthis in Yemen have suffered severe attrition of their radar and missile sites from sustained international strikes. The Shiite militia groups in Iraq and Syria are facing heavy leadership losses, and local governments are increasingly cracking down on their operational freedom.
This brings up a critical point about the branding of these groups.
The PR side of things.
Exactly. For years, Tehran successfully marketed these proxies to the wider Arab and Islamic world as resistance movements.
Right.
They sold a romanticized narrative of righteous anti-imperial defiance.
But the brutal reality of this war has completely destroyed that rebrand. The text explicitly notes that across the region, these groups are increasingly recognized not as liberators, but as engines of destruction that drag entire societies toward crisis.
That shift in public perception is huge. When people in the region look at the absolute ruin of Gaza, the destruction in southern Lebanon, and the economic isolation of Yemen, the narrative of resistance rings incredibly hollow.
It really does.
The population see that aligning with Iran's proxy network doesn't bring prosperity or liberation. It brings your society into the crosshairs of a devastating war.
You know, think of it like a shady franchise business.
Okay, I like this.
Tehran is the corporate headquarters. They convinced all these local franchises, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, to adopt their business model.
Right, the resistance model.
But suddenly, corporate headquarters gets its bank accounts frozen, its executives are indicted, and the supply trucks stop arriving. The local franchises are left holding the bag, surrounded by angry customers with absolutely no support from the home office.
That is a highly accurate analogy.
The hub-and-spoke model fails the moment the hub is under direct threat and the spokes are severed.
And it brings us to the ultimate question posed by our sources. Having measured the full, comprehensive scope of this structural destruction, from the leadership to the proxies to the economy, what happens next? Where does this lead?
This brings us back to Paramendra Bhagat, the blogger whose passionate commentary frames Spencer's cold military assessment.
Right, the guy who volunteered for Obama.
Yes. Bhagat looks at all this destruction and sees a very specific, highly optimistic window for immediate change.
He does. Bhagat's core argument is that the Islamic Republic is currently at its absolute weakest point in its history. He poses the question, if it will not fall now, when will it fall?
But interestingly, his primary demand is not for continued military bombardment.
No, not at all. He is incredibly direct about wanting this to end through internal uprising and strict diplomatic ultimatums.
He writes that he wants the Iranian streets and the massive global Iranian diaspora to erupt in protest and force the regime's collapse from the inside.
And regarding the nuclear issue, his terms are absolute. He says the program must end entirely, the enriched uranium must be physically handed over, and he gives a breathtakingly short timeline of just a few weeks for all of this to be implemented.
A few weeks. I mean, that is incredibly fast for geopolitical movement.
It is a deeply optimistic view that relies heavily on the power of civil resistance. He essentially warns the Iranian diaspora that the window is closing, writing, if they still don't move, that is on them. He also presents a stark warning that if the regime is allowed to survive and rebuild, we are guaranteed to see another, potentially worse war in just a few years.
But we have to inject some realism here, or at least play devil's advocate regarding Bhagat's expectations.
Please do.
Is it realistic to look at a population that is enduring severe internet blackouts, struggling to afford basic food due to hyperinflation, and living under an entrenched authoritarian security apparatus, and expect them to swiftly overthrow their government just because the military has lost its high-end missile capabilities.
History suggests it is a massive gamble. On one hand, yes, the structural weakness of the regime provides an unprecedented opportunity for domestic unrest to gain traction.
Sure.
But on the other hand, decapitated and cornered authoritarian regimes frequently become more brutal and violently repressive toward their own citizens in order to maintain their grip on power. The internal security forces, like the Bajij, are still armed and willing to use lethal force against protesters.
And Fagat's timeline of a few weeks to safely dismantle a complex nuclear infrastructure, hand over enriched uranium, and transition power seems almost impossibly ambitious.
It likely ignores the incredibly messy, protracted, and often bloody reality of actual regime collapse or diplomatic surrender. And this is where Bhagat's passionate demands contrast sharply with the more cautious, measured analysis provided by Spencer.
Right. Well, Bhagat wants a clean, swift resolution driven by street protests. Spencer warns us against reducing this incredibly complex geopolitical shift into neat little media slogans.
Spencer specifically calls out the narratives you frequently hear on cable news panels. Slogans like, Iran is winning because they're still firing, or America is losing influence, or Trump is trapped in a Middle East quagmire.
Trump is trapped, meaning the narrative that the U.S. is stuck in an unwinnable, endless cycle of violence because Iran can still manage to launch an occasional drone or fund a localized militia attack.
Exactly. Spencer counters that narrative by demanding we look at the strategic math. He argues that those pessimistic slogans willfully ignore the immense strategic value of what has actually been achieved.
Because you have to measure what Iran has irreversibly lost against what it can theoretically still do.
And what the world has gained in the process. Spencer points out the massive value of preventing a state sponsor of terrorism from crossing the threshold into becoming a nuclear-armed power.
That's huge.
He points to the value of degrading a regime that has spent decades destabilizing its neighbors and the importance of reestablishing freedom of navigation for global commerce.
The point is that strategic victory doesn't always look like a neat peace treaty signed on the deck of a battleship.
Rarely does these days.
Sometimes strategic victory looks like the systematic reduction of an adversary's capacity to project power, leaving them contained, isolated, and structurally incapable of achieving their long-term goals.
Hold on.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what does all this mean for you, the listener? Why does understanding this structural math matter to your everyday life?
It matters because navigating the modern information landscape requires a tremendous amount of patience.
And a willingness to look past the flashing red lights.
It requires recognizing that the boring metrics, the destruction of machine tooling centers, the fracturing of specialized supply chains, the plunging value of a currency, and the severing of logistical land bridges, those dictate the reality of global security far more than a sensationalized 5-second video of an explosion on your timeline.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started by cutting through the media circus that profits from a neck-and-neck narrative.
Right.
We uncovered the catastrophic decapitation of Iran's institutional leadership and the permanent loss of their strategic architects. We looked at the rubble of their nuclear fait accompli, realizing that while the blueprints remain, the industrial ecosystem is erased.
We saw how their conventional missile production collapsed and how their strategy to hold the global economy hostage at the Strait of Hormuz backfired.
Leading to their own geographic isolation.
Exactly.
We explored how losing control of their airspace magnified every vulnerability, triggering capital flight, hyperinflation, and a domestic crisis they're desperately trying to hide behind internet blackouts.
And finally, we tracked the collapse of the Ring of Fire, watching their proxy franchises crumble as vital logistical routes like the Syrian land bridge were permanently severed. But before we sign off, there is one final, somewhat unsettling thought drawn directly from Spencer's analysis that we need to leave you with.
Lay it on us.
Spencer writes a very profound warning. Damaged powers can remain dangerous for long periods of time. History is full of weakened states, capable of lashing out violently, even while losing the broader balance of power around them.
Wow. It brings us right back to that image we started with. The concussed, broken fighter in the 12th round.
Yeah.
He has lost the fight structurally. The scorecards are a blowout. His endurance is gone. But he is still standing in the ring, and he is still throwing wild, desperate punches.
And that is the question you must ponder as you watch the news in the coming weeks and months. Is a shattered, cornered regime actually more likely to trigger a localized catastrophe in its dying days than it was at the height of its calculated strategic power?
That's chilling.
When a regime looks around, realizes its grand fait accompli has failed entirely, and decides it has absolutely nothing left to lose. What does that final wild punch look like?
It is a sobering, terrifying thought. But it is the kind of reality you can only see when you stop looking at the scoreboard the media wants to show you and start looking at the actual foundations of power. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, keep demanding the structural metrics, and as always, keep looking beneath the surface.